There is a photograph. It was taken sometime in the mid-1800s. A man stands in front of a building. Nothing unusual about that, but look closer. The building behind him, the windows start not at the ground floor, but several feet below it. The doors open downward, into steps that descend beneath the street level. The stonework around the entrance is not worn or eroded. It is clean, it is precise, it is deliberate, and yet it is buried. Someone asks the obvious question. Why would anyone build a door that opens underground? And that is where this story begins. My name is not important. What is important is that you have lived long enough to know that history has a way of hiding its most uncomfortable truths in plain sight. You have lived through decades of change, through moments when something that everyone believed turned out to be only partially true or completely wrong. You know the feeling of standing in a room and suddenly understanding that what you were taught as a child was incomplete. This story will give you that feeling again. Except this time, it is not about one event or one country or one war. It is about the entire world in the same century at the same time, and it is about mud, not ordinary mud. Not the mud of a rainy afternoon or a flooded street corner. I am talking about a layer of sediment so vast, so uniform, so deliberately overlooked that it changes everything we think we know about the 19th century. Researchers call it the mud flood. Historians do not like to talk about it, but the evidence is sitting in cities across Europe, across North America, across Central Asia, right now, waiting for you to look. Here is what we know. In hundreds of cities built during the 1700s and 1800s, the ground floors of older buildings are underground, not because they sank, not because the land rose, but because at some point between 1800 and 1900, a layer of material, mud, sediment, earth, was deposited across vast stretches of the civilized world, and the lower portions of existing structures were swallowed by it. In St. Petersburg, Russia, there are buildings where the first-floor windows look out directly onto the pavement, except they are not on the first floor. They are on what was the second floor. The first floor is below the street. In Kazan, in Odessa, in old neighborhoods of Chicago, in parts of Edinburgh, Scotland, in Istanbul. In cities that have nothing geographically in common with each other, the same pattern repeats itself. Buildings built with basements that are too large, too ornate, too detailed to ever have been intended as basements. Buildings where the lower windows are arched and decorative and sealed shut, not because they were additions, but because what they once opened onto no longer exists. The ground came up to meet them and stayed. Now you might say that could be explained. Cities build up over time. Centuries of foot traffic, construction debris, raised roads, all of that accumulates. And yes, that is true in some cases, but not in these cases, because the pattern is too consistent. And because the timeline is too narrow. These cities, spread across 3 continents, all show the same thing happening in roughly the same historical window, between 1800 and 1880. A century that we are told was the age of progress, of industry, of empire and expansion, and yet buried beneath that century is something that the official narrative never explains. A physical layer of the world that was simply covered over and then forgotten. Walk through a city like Nuremberg in Germany, or walk through the old sections of Philadelphia, and you will find buildings from the 1700s where if you go down into what was called the cellar, you find rooms. Not storage rooms, not rough-dug holes in the earth, but rooms, with plastered walls, with fireplaces, with window frames where the glass was never installed because by the time anyone moved in, those windows were already facing dirt. Rooms that were built to be lived in and then buried before a single family ever ate a meal inside them. This is not a basement. This is a ground floor that lost its ground. Some researchers who have looked at this evidence point to something else. They point to the population records of the early 19th century, and here the story becomes more than architectural. Because the census data from Europe and North America in the early 1800s shows something strange. There are large geographical areas where the population is documented as being very sparse. Far too sparse to account for the density and sophistication of the infrastructure that was already in place. Roads that required enormous organized labor to build, canals that took decades of coordinated effort, and yet no records of the workforce that built them. Buildings with construction techniques that predate the claimed building date by 100 years. Entire cities whose documented founding date sits awkwardly beside the obvious age of their oldest structures. Who built all of this, and where did they go? Some historians have proposed, carefully, quietly, in journals that do not attract much mainstream attention, that the 19th century was not the beginning of the story we were told. That there was a civilization before the one we are taught about, one that had developed architecture, city planning, and infrastructure to a level that the officially recognized civilization of the 1800s then inherited and claimed as its own. And that somewhere in the late 1700s or very early 1800s, that previous civilization was either destroyed or dramatically diminished, by what no one can say with certainty. Some point to unusual atmospheric events, some point to geological disruption. Some point to the strange consistency of the mud deposits themselves, which contain in many locations the same types of sediment, the same ratios of material, across distances that make a single local flood impossible as an explanation. Here is the part that stays with you at night. In many cities, when construction workers dig below the modern street level to lay new pipe or to install new foundations, they do not find bedrock or simple earth. They find floors. Intact floors of fired brick, of cut stone, laid in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. They find walls that were clearly once interior walls of structures. They find hearths. In Edinburgh, workers renovating cellars in the old town have found rooms below the rooms, preserved under several feet of material that was deposited, not gradually, but apparently all at once. The sediment layer does not show signs of gradual accumulation, the kind you would expect from centuries of human activity. It shows signs of a single event, a deposit, a covering. As if something came and laid a blanket across the lower portions of the world, and the world went on above it. There is a researcher, a woman in her 60s now, who spent years documenting the sealed windows of old buildings in Central Asia. She photographed dozens of structures in cities along the old Silk Road, where the ground floor arches were filled in not from inside, not bricked up by the building's owners, but filled in from the outside, from below, by accumulated material that simply pressed against the glass and mortar until the windows became walls. She said in an interview, and I am not quoting her exactly but capturing the spirit of what she described, that she felt as if she were looking at a world that had been politely erased, not destroyed. Not burned, not conquered, just covered, gently, completely covered. And here is where I want to speak directly to those of you who have lived through enough history to understand what it means when something is left out. You have seen governments revise their stories. You have watched official explanations dissolve over time when the documents finally surfaced. You know the feeling of being told that something is settled, only to discover that it was settled by people who had reasons to settle it a certain way. The mud flood is not a conspiracy theory in the sensationalist meaning of that phrase. It is a physical observation. The mud is there. The buried buildings are there. The sealed windows and the underground rooms are there. What is missing is the explanation. And the absence of an explanation, in an era when we pride ourselves on knowing almost everything about the 19th century, is itself something worth sitting with. Because if there was a world before the world we know, a world that built grandly and organized itself across continents and left behind cities that we then repopulated and renamed and claimed as our own creations, then the history we were taught is not wrong exactly. It is just a chapter that begins in the middle of the book. And the earlier chapters were covered in mud and then papered over with new stories, and then those stories became textbooks, and those textbooks became the truth that generations were raised on. Including yours, including mine. There is a word in architecture, spolia, from the Latin. It refers to the practice of taking stones, columns, carvings from older buildings and incorporating them into new ones. The Romans did it with Greek temples. Medieval builders did it with Roman monuments. The practice is documented and accepted, and no one finds it troubling. But what if the entire 19th century industrial world was built on spolia? Not just stones, but entire cities, entire road networks, entire systems of canals and aqueducts, inherited from a people whose name we do not know, whose story was submerged along with their ground floors. What if the great exhibitions of the 1800s, the Crystal Palace, the grand civic buildings, the railroad stations with their cathedral-like proportions, were not the achievements of a civilization rising, but the achievements of a civilization resettling, moving into rooms that were already built, raising the ground around them, and calling it progress. I do not ask you to believe this, I ask you to look. Next time you see a photograph of a 19th century city, look at where the windows meet the street. Look at how deep the stoops descend before the door. Look at the proportion of the first floor windows to the windows above them. Look at which buildings, the grandest ones, the oldest ones, seem to have been designed for a ground that no longer exists. And then ask yourself what would have to be true for this to make sense. Not who did it, not why it was hidden, just what would have to be true. Because sometimes the most honest thing a person can say, after a lifetime of accepting what they were told, is simply this: I am not sure that is the whole story, and the mud is still there. And the rooms beneath the rooms are still there, and the doors that open below the street are still there, exactly where they always were. Waiting for someone to ask the question that was always the right question: what happened here? What happened to the world that built this? And where did all of that mud come from? This is the mud flood. This is the story that the 19th century buried. You decide what to do with it.